The morning sunlight crept through the tall windows of the Jefferson County Courthouse, casting geometric patterns across polished marble floors. Lawyers, clerks, and officers buzzed through the lobby, their voices echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Most were too wrapped up in their own worries to notice the quiet, poised figure slipping inside. A black woman, mid-50s, her eyes sharp behind elegant glasses, her posture relaxed but dignified. Her name was Justice Simone Carter, though almost no one outside the highest echelons of American law enforcement would have recognized her by face. Only a handful of people in the city had ever seen her outside her Supreme Court robes. This morning, Simone wore a tailored navy suit that had seen better days but still carried the weight of authority. She moved with the practiced confidence of someone used to both scrutiny and secrecy. Her grandmother's pearl earrings caught the light as she paused to take in the familiar chaos of the courthouse, a place where justice was supposed to be served, but where she had learned, through decades of experience, that justice often wore different faces depending on who was looking. She took the elevator up to the third floor where a routine legal seminar was about to begin. The city's Bar Association was holding an annual continuing legal education event. Judges, lawyers, and hopeful new associates mingled in the hallway, sipping bad coffee and trading courtroom war stories. The air smelled of stale coffee and old leather briefcases, mixed with the faint scent of floor wax and the nervous energy of ambitious young lawyers trying to make connections. Simone quietly signed in at the registration table, her signature a careful script that revealed nothing of her true position. She nodded at the greeter, an older black woman named Dorothy, who had worked the courthouse for 30 years. Dorothy's eyes widened slightly in recognition, but she simply gave Simone a knowing smile and a barely perceptible nod of respect. To everyone else, she was just another participant, perhaps a visiting professor, maybe a seasoned litigator from out of town, possibly even a paralegal seeking continuing education credits. No one suspected they were sharing oxygen with a sitting Supreme Court justice. The anonymity was both a burden and a gift. She could observe, listen, and learn without the weight of expectation that usually followed her presence. On the far side of the room, Brandon Whitaker was holding court. A partner at one of the city's most powerful law firms, Brandon was tall, athletic, with expensive Italian leather shoes and a grin that never quite reached his eyes. His reputation for ruthlessness was only matched by his arrogance. Lawyers whispered that he could slice up a witness with a single question and that he never missed a chance to remind everyone of it. Brandon had grown up in Jefferson's most exclusive neighborhood, the son of a federal judge who had paved every road his son would walk. His Harvard law degree hung prominently in his corner office, surrounded by photos of him shaking hands with senators, governors, and Supreme Court justices he'd never bothered to actually listen to. He saw the legal profession as a game to be won, not a sacred trust to be honored. He noticed Simone only as she approached the coffee urn, waiting her turn behind a junior associate who was nervously checking his phone. Brandon's eyes performed their usual assessment, a habit he'd developed over years of quickly categorizing people into useful or dismissible categories. He glanced at her shoes, sensible, not flashy. He noted her briefcase, a battered leather case, worn at the edges, the kind an overworked public defender might carry. Her jewelry was minimal, her clothing professional, but not expensive. Without hesitation, he pegged her as a nobody, maybe a public defender, maybe even a court-appointed translator or social worker. "Excuse me," Brandon said, sliding in beside her with the casual entitlement of someone who had never been told no. His voice was smooth, practiced, and just a touch patronizing, the tone he used with witnesses he intended to demolish. "If you're not familiar with these events, the registration table is out front. They can help you with the forms." Simone glanced at him, her face unreadable. She had encountered 1,000 Brandon Whitakers in her career, men who looked at her and saw only what they expected to see. "Thank you, I've already signed in." Brandon smiled, undeterred. The dismissal only made him more determined to establish his superiority. "That's good. These events can be a little overwhelming, I know. The legal terminology, the procedural discussions, it's quite different from paralegal work." He paused, watching for her reaction. "If you need any help understanding the CLE requirements, just ask. I'm a partner at Whitaker, Russell, and Graves." He waited for the spark of recognition, the awe, the deference, the subtle change in posture that usually accompanied his introduction. But Simone only nodded, murmured "noted," and turned back to her coffee with the calm of someone who had heard more impressive credentials before breakfast. Brandon's smile faltered for half a second before he moved on, zeroing in on a pair of young law students who were eager to bask in his wisdom and collect his business card. The seminar began in a stately conference room lined with law books and faded portraits of old white men in powdered wigs. Simone took a seat near the back, her notebook opened, her pen poised. She had learned long ago that the back of the room offered the best vantage point, close enough to hear everything, far enough to remain unnoticed. Around her, lawyers jockeyed for position, some sitting up front to be seen, others lingering at the edges, checking phones and whispering about cases, clients, and courthouse gossip. The morning light filtered through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny witnesses to the proceedings. A young black attorney, Jasmine Williams, slid into the seat beside her. Jasmine was in her early 30s, her hair pulled back in a professional bun, her suit crisp but clearly off the rack. She carried herself with the careful precision of someone who had learned that one mistake could undo years of hard work. Jasmine's voice was barely a whisper. "You're Simone Carter, right? Simone's gaze was gentle but firm. "Let's keep that between us for now." Jasmine's eyes widened and she nodded quickly, a mix of excitement and nervousness flickering across her face. "It's an honor, ma'am. I've read your dissents, the one in Henderson versus State. It changed the way I see the law." Simone smiled, the briefest flicker of warmth crossing her features. "Thank you, Jasmine. Keep working hard. There's always more to do." The weight of that statement settled between them. Jasmine had grown up in Jefferson's East Side, the daughter of a single mother who cleaned offices at night to pay for her daughter's education. She had clawed her way through law school, working multiple jobs, studying in hospital waiting rooms while her mother recovered from a heart attack. She understood that more to do meant more than just legal briefs and court appearances. It meant changing a system that had been built to exclude people like them. At the podium, the first speaker was introduced, Brandon Whitaker, here to discuss advanced litigation strategies in civil rights cases. The irony was not lost on Simone, who had spent the previous evening reviewing Brandon's track record, a string of victories defending corporations and institutions against discrimination claims. Brandon's presentation was everything people expected, slick, authoritative, peppered with jokes that only half the room found funny. He spoke about civil rights law with the detached confidence of someone who had never lived it, never felt the weight of discrimination, never wondered if his race would be held against him in a courtroom. "The key to defending these cases," Brandon said, clicking through his PowerPoint slides, "is to remember that emotion has no place in the law. These plaintiffs often come in with compelling stories, but stories aren't evidence. Our job is to separate the wheat from the chaff, to focus on what can be proven, not what can be felt." In the audience, several young lawyers of color shifted uncomfortably. Jasmine clenched her pen tighter, her jaw set. Simone remained perfectly still, but her eyes never left Brandon's face. Now, I know some of you might be thinking about the so-called systemic issues, Brandon continued, making air quotes with his fingers. But remember, the law deals with individual cases, individual complaints. We can't solve society's problems from the courtroom. That's not our job. When it came time for questions, Simone raised her hand. The room went quiet, not because they recognized her, but because something in her bearing commanded attention. "Yes," Brandon called, barely concealing his boredom. He had expected softball questions, opportunities to show off his expertise. Simone's question was precise, referencing a complex aspect of recent constitutional law that dealt with the intersection of individual rights and systemic discrimination. In light of the Supreme Court's recent decision in Williams versus Department of Education, how do you reconcile your approach with the court's finding that individual cases can indeed reflect broader patterns of discrimination? Brandon faltered. For a moment, he didn't have an answer. The question revealed not just a deep understanding of current law, but an awareness of its evolving nature that his presentation had completely ignored. He covered with a smirk the same expression he used when he wanted to diminish a witness. "That's a pretty technical question. I'm not sure if we want to go down that rabbit hole right now. Maybe if you're interested, we can discuss it during the break." He paused, looking around the room for validation. "Besides, I think some of our colleagues might find it a bit advanced." A few people laughed, but others watched, intrigued by the poised black woman who had just made the city's top litigator stumble. Jasmine grinned, suppressing the urge to cheer. Simone's lips barely twitched. "It's not about winning, Jasmine," she would later tell the young attorney. "It's about asking the right questions." During the break, Simone stepped outside for air. The courthouse plaza was busy with the usual mix of lawyers, defendants, family members, and court personnel. She stood in the shade of an old oak tree watching the flow of people, each carrying their own hopes, fears, and stories of justice sought or denied. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister Brianna. "Saw the news about the Jefferson case. You presiding. Call me." Simone smiled. Brianna was the only person who could read between the lines of legal news and figure out when her sister was involved. They had grown up together in Chicago's South Side, sharing a tiny bedroom in their grandmother's house, while their parents worked double shifts to keep the family afloat. Their grandmother, Mama Rose, had been a domestic worker who cleaned the homes of wealthy white families on the North Side. She would come home with stories not bitter, but observant. "Baby girl," she would tell young Simone, "the world's gonna try to tell you who you are. But you remember, you are who God made you to be, and that's more than enough." Mama Rose had died the year Simone graduated from law school, but her words had followed Simone through every challenge, every doubt, every moment when the weight of being the only black woman in the room threatened to crush her spirit. A young man approached, Marcus Thompson, a recent law school graduate who worked as a clerk in the courthouse. He was nervous, shifting from foot to foot. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't mean to bother you, but are you Justice Carter?" Simone looked at him carefully. Marcus was perhaps 25, with intelligent eyes and a cheap suit that had been pressed with care. She recognized something in his expression, the mixture of hope and fear that came with dreams that seemed impossible. "I am," she said simply. Marcus's face lit up. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, my little sister wrote a paper about you last year for her civics class. She said you prove that people like us can make it to the top." Simone felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the weight of representation, the knowledge that her success was never just about her. "What's your sister's name?" "Tasha. She's 14. She wants to be a lawyer, too." Tell Tasha that the work starts now. Every day, every choice, every moment. She decides to keep going despite what the world tells her. That's the work. And tell her she's not alone. Marcus nodded, tears in his eyes. Thank you, Justice Carter. Thank you for showing us the way. As he walked away, Simone felt the full weight of what was coming. The case this afternoon would not just be about one plaintiff's claim. It would be about whether the law truly served everyone or just those who looked like Brandon Whitaker. During the break, Brandon caught up to Simone by the elevators. He had spent the last hour nursing his wounded pride and trying to figure out who this woman was who had so casually exposed his ignorance. He leaned in, lowering his voice to the conspiratorial tone he used when he wanted to establish insider status. You're pretty sharp. Remind me where you practice. Simone's answer was mild, giving nothing away. Mostly appellate work. I handle constitutional cases. Brandon's eyes narrowed. He was used to being able to place people in the legal hierarchy, to know who mattered and who didn't. Appellate work, huh? State or federal? Both. Which firm? I work for the government. Brandon's expression shifted slightly. Government work was respectable, but it didn't pay well, and it certainly didn't carry the prestige of private practice. Well, if you ever want to learn about real trial work, let me know. There's a lot they don't teach in books, a lot they don't teach in government seminars either. The elevator doors slid open. Simone stepped inside, her expression unchanged. Thank you for the offer. I'll keep it in mind. Brandon didn't notice Dorothy, the receptionist, watching the exchange from behind the information desk. She shook her head slowly, a mixture of amusement and disgust on her face. In 30 years of working the courthouse, she had seen this scene play out countless times, powerful men assuming they knew who belonged and who didn't, never bothering to look beyond their own prejudices. As the elevator doors closed, Dorothy whispered to herself, Lord, that man is about to learn something today. That afternoon, the atmosphere around the courthouse changed. News trucks began arriving, their satellite dishes extending toward the sky, like mechanical flowers seeking the sun. The case, Taylor versus City of Jefferson, had drawn national attention, not just for its legal implications, but for what it represented in the broader conversation about race, power, and justice in America. Monique Johnson, the plaintiff, sat in the courthouse cafeteria with her legal team. She was a woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. For 15 years, she had worked as a budget analyst for the city, quietly doing her job, raising her daughter Kayla, and trying to build a life that her own mother, a domestic worker, had only dreamed of. Everything changed when Monique discovered discrepancies in the city's minority contracting program. Contracts that were supposed to go to minority-owned businesses were being funneled to shell companies controlled by white contractors. When she reported the fraud, she was told to mind her own business. When she persisted, she was transferred to a basement office with no windows. When she filed a formal complaint, she was fired for insubordination. I keep thinking about my mama, Monique said to her lawyer, Darius Bell, a seasoned civil rights attorney with silver hair and kind eyes. She cleaned white folks' houses for 40 years, never complained, never caused trouble. She told me education was the key, that if I got my degree, worked hard, played by the rules, I'd be safe. Darius nodded. He had represented dozens of clients like Monique, good people who had believed in the system until the system betrayed them. Your mama was right about education. She just didn't know the rules were different for different people. Across the cafeteria, Jasmine Williams sat with her mentor, Andre Foster, a veteran civil rights lawyer who had been fighting these battles since the 1970s. Andre was in his 60s now, his beard more gray than black, but his eyes still burned with the fire of someone who had never stopped believing in justice. "This case is bigger than Monique," Andre said, stirring his coffee. "It's about whether we're going to keep pretending that individual acts of discrimination aren't part of a larger pattern. Brandon Whitaker's going to argue that Monique was just a bad employee, that race had nothing to do with it. But we know better." Jasmine nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about Justice Carter, about the quiet dignity with which she had asked her question that morning. "Mr. Foster, what do you think it means that Justice Carter is presiding?" Andre smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn all day. "It means we might finally get a fair hearing. That woman has been fighting for justice since before you were born. She knows what it's like to be underestimated, to be told you don't belong. If anyone can see through Brandon Whitaker's act, it's her." Brandon strutted into the courtroom with his usual confidence, his team of associates trailing behind him like well-dressed soldiers. He barely glanced at the crowd, assuming victory was inevitable. In his mind, this was just another case, another opportunity to demonstrate his superiority and protect his clients from what he saw as frivolous claims. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled and people stood along the walls. In the gallery, members of Jefferson's black community sat alongside civil rights activists, law students, and journalists. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of electric tension that comes before something important, something that will be remembered. Simone entered through the judge's entrance, her movements deliberate and graceful. She had changed into her robes, the black fabric transforming her from an anonymous observer to the embodiment of judicial authority. As she took her place at the bench, the bailiff called the court to order. "All rise. The Honorable Justice Simone Carter, Supreme Court of the United States, presiding." The words hit the courtroom like a physical force. A collective gasp rose from the gallery. Brandon's jaw dropped, the blood draining from his face as he stared at the woman he had patronized just hours earlier. In the gallery, Jasmine Williams grinned from ear to ear. Andre Foster nodded slowly, satisfaction written across his features. Marcus Thompson, the young court clerk, whispered to his colleague, "That's her. That's the one I told you about." Simone settled into her chair, adjusted her glasses, and looked out over the courtroom with the calm authority of someone who had earned her place at the highest levels of American jurisprudence. Her gaze passed over Brandon, not lingering, not gloating, simply acknowledging his presence. "Counselor Whitaker," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, "are you ready to proceed?" Brandon stammered, his usual confidence shattered. "Yes, Your Honor." The transformation was complete. The woman he had dismissed as inconsequential now held his professional fate in her hands. Around the room, lawyers, law students, and even reporters watched with a mixture of shock and something approaching glee. This was justice, not as an abstract concept, but as a living, breathing reality, and it was about to begin. The opening statements began with Darius Bell rising to address the court. His voice was measured, respectful, but infused with the quiet passion of someone who had spent decades fighting for the underdog. "Your Honor, this case is about more than one woman's career. It's about whether we live in a society where doing the right thing, exposing corruption, and fighting fraud is rewarded or punished. Monique Johnson didn't just lose her job. She lost her faith in the system she had served faithfully for 15 years. Bell laid out the case methodically, how Monique had discovered the fraudulent contracting scheme, how she had followed proper procedures in reporting it, and how she had been systematically punished for her integrity. He presented documents, emails, and testimony that painted a clear picture of retaliation. "The city will argue that Ms. Johnson was fired for cause," Bell continued. but the evidence will show that the only cause was her refusal to stay silent about corruption. In America, we should not have to choose between our jobs and our consciences. When it was Brandon's turn, he rose with less than his usual swagger. The presence of Justice Carter at the bench had rattled him, but he was still a skilled attorney, still dangerous when cornered. Your Honor, the plaintiff was terminated for insubordination and failure to perform her duties. The city's minority contracting program is and has always been in full compliance with all applicable laws. Ms. Johnson's allegations are based on misunderstandings and, frankly, a pattern of disruptive behavior that made her unsuitable for continued employment. But even as he spoke, Brandon could feel the ground shifting beneath him. In courtrooms across the country, he had delivered similar arguments, dismissing claims of discrimination as misunderstandings, painting plaintiffs as troublemakers, relying on the assumption that judges would default to protecting institutions over individuals. Today felt different. Justice Carter listened to every word, her expression neutral but her attention complete. She took notes, asked clarifying questions, and treated both attorneys with equal respect. But that equality itself was revolutionary in a system where Brandon was used to being favored. The first witness was Ted Mason, a city payroll clerk, who had worked alongside Monique for 7 years. Tyrone was a quiet man in his 50s with calloused hands and nervous eyes. He had never been in a courtroom before, never been on television, never been asked to speak publicly about anything. Under Bell's questioning, Ted explained what he had seen: contracts being awarded to companies that existed only on paper, minority businesses being told their bids were too high, while shell companies submitted identical bids that were accepted, city officials meeting privately with white contractors, while minority business owners waited in outer offices. "I didn't want to get involved," Ted said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I got a family to feed, but Monique, she said we couldn't just watch and do nothing. She said if we didn't speak up, who would?" When Brandon cross-examined him, he employed his usual tactics, aggressive questioning designed to confuse and intimidate. "Mr. Mason, you've worked for the city for 15 years, correct?" "Yes, sir." "And in those 15 years, have you ever been disciplined for any reason?" "No, sir." "Never been late, never missed a deadline, never had any complaints?" Tyrone hesitated. "Well, I was late a few times when my wife was sick." "Ah, so you have been disciplined. And yet you want this court to believe that you're a reliable witness." Bell objected, but Brandon continued his assault. "How many contracts have you personally reviewed, Mr. Mason?" "I don't review contracts, I process payroll." "So you're testifying about things you have no expertise in, matters outside your job description." "I testified about what I saw, what you think you saw, what you interpreted through your own biases and assumptions." Justice Carter's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Mr. Whitaker, the witness has answered your question. Move on." Brandon paused, thrown off balance. In other courtrooms, his aggressive style was often tolerated, even admired. Here it was being checked. "Your Honor, I'm simply trying to establish—" "The witness's credibility is for the jury to determine. Your job is to ask relevant questions, not to badger. Continue." The reprimand was gentle but firm, and it reverberated through the courtroom. In the gallery, young lawyers took notes, watching a masterclass in judicial authority. Brandon's face flushed, but he continued his questioning in a more subdued tone. The next witness was Janet Morrison, a white city employee who had worked in the contracting office. Janet was clearly uncomfortable, her hands shaking as she took the oath. She had been granted immunity in exchange for her testimony, but her loyalty to the city ran deep. Under Bell's questioning, Janet revealed the inner workings of the fraudulent scheme. She described meetings where city officials discussed the need to manage minority contracting requirements, conversations about creating paper companies to fulfill quotas while ensuring the real work went to reliable contractors. There was a spreadsheet, Janet said, her voice growing stronger as she continued. It showed which minority businesses would get small contracts just enough to meet the legal requirements and which shell companies would get the big jobs. Bell produced the spreadsheet, entering it into evidence. The document was damning, a clear blueprint for systematic discrimination disguised as compliance. When Brandon cross-examined Janet, he tried to paint her as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. But the documentary evidence was overwhelming. Every question he asked seemed to dig the city deeper into its hole. Ms. Morrison, you were facing criminal charges when you agreed to testify, weren't you? Yes, sir. So you had every incentive to lie, to tell the prosecutors and this court whatever they wanted to hear. Janet straightened in her chair, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. Sir, I was facing charges because I participated in fraud. I'm here because I want to make it right. The documents speak for themselves. Justice Carter leaned forward slightly. Mr. Whitaker, the documents have been authenticated and entered into evidence. Do you have questions about the witness's direct testimony? Brandon fumbled through his remaining questions, but the damage was done. The evidence was clear, the pattern undeniable. What had been designed as a routine defense of institutional authority had become an exposure of systematic corruption. During a recess, Monique Johnson sat in the courthouse bathroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The stress of the trial had aged her, carved lines around her eyes and mouth that hadn't been there a year ago. She thought about her daughter Kayla, now 17 and preparing for college. Mama, Kayla had said the night before, are you sure this is worth it? We could move away, start over somewhere else. Monique had held her daughter close, smelling the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the weight of every sacrifice they had made. Baby, if we don't fight this, who will? If we don't stand up now, when will we? But the doubt was real. Since filing the lawsuit, Monique had struggled to find work. Other city employees avoided her, afraid of being associated with a troublemaker. Her savings were drained, her credit damaged. Some nights she lay awake wondering if she had made the right choice. The bathroom door opened and Jasmine Williams entered. The two women had never met before the trial, but they shared an understanding born of common experience. Mrs. Johnson, Jasmine said gently, how are you holding up? Monique tried to smile. Some days are harder than others, but I keep thinking about all the people who came before us, who fought so we could have what we have. I can't let them down. Jasmine nodded. You're not letting anyone down. You're carrying the torch forward. Outside the bathroom, they could hear the bustle of the courthouse. Lawyers arguing, phones ringing, the constant motion of a system that was supposed to serve everyone but too often served only the powerful. Whatever happens, Jasmine said, you've already won. You've shown them that they can't silence us, that we won't just disappear quietly. Monique smiled, and for the first time in months, it reached her eyes. Then let's go finish this. Brandon's defense strategy had been simple. Portray Monique as a disgruntled employee whose accusations were motivated by personal grievances rather than genuine concerns about fraud. He had lined up character witnesses prepared to attack her performance reviews and planned to paint her as someone who couldn't handle the demands of her job. But the documentary evidence had destroyed that narrative. The spreadsheet, the emails, the recorded conversations, all of it pointed to a systematic effort to circumvent minority contracting requirements while maintaining the appearance of compliance. Desperate, Brandon called the city's contracting director, Paul Stevens, to the stand. Stevens was a career bureaucrat, a man who had perfected the art of bureaucratic doublespeak for over 20 years in city government. "Mr. Stevens," Brandon began, "how long have you overseen the city's minority contracting program?" 8 years. "And in that time, has the city consistently met its minority contracting goals?" "Yes, we have always been in compliance with all applicable regulations." "Did you ever instruct anyone to discriminate against minority-owned businesses?" "Absolutely not. The city is committed to diversity and inclusion." But when Bell cross-examined Stevens, the carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Bell produced emails in which Stevens discussed the need to work around minority requirements, conversations about managing the optics of the program, while ensuring that real work went to established contractors. "Mr. Stevens, what did you mean when you wrote to the mayor's office that you needed to massage the numbers for the minority contracting report?" Stevens shifted uncomfortably. "I meant that we needed to ensure accurate reporting. And when you wrote about creative solutions for meeting federal requirements, I meant finding innovative ways to expand opportunities." Bell's voice remained calm, but his questions grew more pointed. "Mr. Stevens, isn't it true that you maintain 2 sets of books, one showing compliance with federal regulations and another showing the actual flow of contracts?" "I object," Brandon shouted, but the objection was weak, and he knew it. Justice Carter looked at Stevens with the steady gaze of someone who had seen every form of institutional deception. "The witness will answer the question." Stevens' answer was a study in evasion, but his discomfort was obvious to everyone in the courtroom. The truth was written in his body language, in the way he avoided eye contact, in the long pauses before his answers. The courtroom was silent as Justice Carter called for a sidebar. Brandon and Bell approached the bench, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. "Mr. Whitaker," Justice Carter said, her voice low but carrying the weight of authority, "I want to be clear about the court's expectations. This is a court of law, not a theater. The evidence will be heard, the facts will be established, and justice will be served. Do you understand?" Brandon nodded, but his confidence was shattered. He had spent his career in courtrooms where his aggressive style was tolerated, where judges deferred to his reputation, where the system seemed designed to protect people like him. Here, facing Justice Carter, he felt exposed and vulnerable. "Your Honor," he said, his voice smaller than usual, "I'm simply trying to present the best defense for my client. Then present facts, not theatrics. Present evidence, not innuendo. The court expects better from officers of the court." When they returned to their positions, the dynamic in the courtroom had shifted. Brandon's next witness, a city official who had been prepared to testify about Monique's difficult behavior, suddenly seemed less certain, less willing to engage in character assassination. In the gallery, the spectators could feel the change. Young lawyers leaned forward, taking notes. Journalists scribbled furiously. Community activists nodded to each other, recognizing that something important was happening. Justice Carter had done more than maintain order. She had reminded everyone that the courtroom was a place where truth mattered, where evidence spoke louder than rhetoric, where justice was possible if everyone committed to the process. Word of the trial had spread throughout Jefferson's black community. At barbershops and beauty salons, at church meetings and family dinners, people talked about what was happening in the courthouse. For many, it was the first time they had seen someone who looked like them, wielding real power in the justice system. At Greater Mount Olive Baptist Church, Pastor Lamar Green addressed his congregation. "We have a sister sitting in judgment today," he said, his voice carrying the rhythm of generations of preachers. "Justice Carter is up there not just for herself, but for all of us. She's showing the world that we belong in every room, at every table, in every position of power." The congregation responded with amens and applause, but Pastor Green's next words were more sobering. "But let's not forget, she's just one person. The system is bigger than any individual. We can't expect her to carry the whole load. We all have to do our part." At Jefferson State University, Professor Angela Davis showed the trial coverage to her constitutional law class. The students, a mix of races and backgrounds, watched with fascination as Justice Carter managed the courtroom with quiet authority. "Notice how she doesn't need to raise her voice," Professor Davis observed. "She doesn't need to bang her gavel or make threats. Her authority comes from her knowledge, her preparation, and her commitment to the law. That's real power." One student, a young white woman named Sarah, raised her hand. "Professor, why is this such a big deal? Aren't all judges supposed to be fair?" The question hung in the air for a moment. An older black student, Marcus, spoke up before the professor could respond. "Because fairness isn't automatic. Because for too long, people who looked like me, like Justice Carter, like the plaintiff, weren't seen as deserving of fairness. This trial is about whether that's finally changing." As the trial entered its final stretch, the atmosphere inside the courthouse shifted from tense anticipation to a quiet, almost sacred seriousness. The air felt heavy, each breath laced with the knowledge that what happened in the next hours would echo far beyond these walls. The rows of pews were packed every day now, not just with legal professionals, but with city workers, church elders, neighborhood organizers, and families with small children on their laps, all drawn to the spectacle and the stakes. Behind the scenes, Brandon Whitaker sat hunched over a cluttered table in the defense conference room, surrounded by stacks of legal pads, binders, and half-drunk coffee cups. The cocky arrogance that once defined him had evaporated, replaced by something raw, uncertainty, even fear. He had called his father, retired Judge Scott Whitaker, twice that morning. The first time, to vent. The second, to confess. "Dad, I don't know what happened," Brandon said, voice low, almost defeated. "Everything fell apart. The judge, she doesn't let anything slide." On the other end of the line, his father's tone was gruff. "You lost control of the narrative, son. That's your job. Control the room, control the jury, control the outcome. If you can't, you lose." Brandon rubbed his eyes, exhausted. "She sees right through me, Dad. The jury sees it too. I thought I could sway them, but I think, no, I know, they're listening to her, not me." A long pause. "You better hope your closing can salvage something, otherwise you might be remembered for the wrong reasons." Brandon hung up, feeling the old tools of his trade. Swagger, charm, bravado had finally failed him. He spent the next hours rewriting, searching for a tone that would persuade but not pander, defend but not destroy. Meanwhile, across the courthouse, Darius Bell and his team gathered in a small room fragrant with takeout coffee and nervous energy. Monique Johnson sat quietly between Jasmine and Malik, listening as Darius rehearsed his closing argument. His words were careful, chosen with the same deliberate care as every step he'd taken in the trial. "We're not just asking for a verdict," he told them. "We're asking this city to reckon with itself." Jasmine squeezed Monique's hand. Malik checked his phone, watching a stream of supportive messages from former clients, law professors, and strangers who'd been following the case online. "They're with us," Malik said quietly. "People are watching. They believe in you." Back in her chambers, Justice Carter prepared for the most public decision of her career. Her routine was the same as always: a cup of herbal tea, a careful review of the case law, and handwritten notes on her legal pad. But tonight she felt the pressure as a living presence. She thought about every person whose fate rested in her hands. Not just Monique, Not just the city officials, but all the people outside who saw something of themselves in this fight. The ones who never made it into the courtroom, who still waited for justice in their own lives. She opened her window a crack, listening to the distant sounds of the city. Church bells, car horns, someone playing jazz on a porch 2 blocks away. She breathed in the night air and tried to remember the promise she'd made to herself when she took the bench. To do justice, love, mercy, and walk humbly. She knew that whatever her verdict, some would call her biased, others a hero. But the law wasn't about their opinions. It was about the truth she could see and the change she could make. In the gallery, the community waited. Some prayed silently, others fidgeted with worry or hope. Pastor Green stood in the back, hands clasped. At Jefferson State, Professor Davis set her students an assignment. Watch the closing arguments. Write what you see about justice, about power, about the role of the court. At home, families crowded around laptops and televisions, holding their collective breath. In beauty salons, women with half-braided hair paused mid-story, eyes fixed on the screen. In barber shops, young men debated the meaning of justice, their arguments sharp but tinged with hope. By dawn, it seemed as if the whole city held its breath, waiting for the gavel to fall. The verdict would not just decide one woman's fate, but announce, at least for a moment, whether fairness, truth, and dignity could win out against power. And for Justice Carter, alone at her desk, the responsibility had never felt heavier or more necessary. Back in the courthouse, the civil rights case had turned into a media frenzy. Reporters crowded the marble steps, news vans double-parked outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical prayers. Within the courtroom, Simone Carter presided with an even hand, each ruling delivered with measured authority that seemed to resonate through the very walls of the building. Her reputation for fairness was legendary, but her patience for disrespect was razor-thin. The case, Taylor versus City of Jefferson, involved a black woman, Monique Johnson, who had been wrongfully terminated from her city job after exposing corruption in the municipal contracts department. She had discovered that certain city officials were steering lucrative deals to companies owned by their friends and family members, skimming taxpayer money while essential services went underfunded. When she reported it, she was first demoted, then harassed, then fired on trumped-up charges of insubordination and failure to follow protocol. Brandon represented the city, arguing for the legitimacy of her dismissal with the same arrogance he'd displayed that morning. On the other side, Darius Bell, a seasoned black civil rights attorney with 20 years of experience fighting these exact battles, advocated for Monique with the quiet intensity of someone who had seen too many good people destroyed by systems that claimed to serve justice, but served only power. Darius approached the bench, his voice calm but carrying the weight of decades of struggle. Your Honor, my client has been silenced, threatened, and erased, not for failing at her job, but for doing it too well. This is not just about one woman losing her livelihood. This is about an entire system that values silence over truth, loyalty over integrity, and fear over justice. Simone nodded, allowing his words to settle over the packed courtroom like stones dropping into still water. Mr. Bell, the court will consider all relevant facts. No one will be silenced here. Brandon rose, his voice carrying that practiced smoothness that had served him well in boardrooms and country clubs. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making this political. This is a simple employment dispute, not a civil rights crusade. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Simone's eyes narrowed slightly, her tone remaining perfectly controlled, but carrying an edge that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. Objection overruled. We're here for justice, not politics, Mr. Whitaker. The distinction between the two should be clear to any attorney practicing in this courtroom. Continue, Mr. Bell. The power dynamic had shifted so subtly that most observers didn't notice it at first. But Brandon felt it in his bones, a cold trickle of unease beneath his tailored suit. For the first time in his career, he was not the smartest person in the room, not the most powerful, not the one setting the rules. Monique Johnson took the witness stand with the quiet dignity of someone who had already lost everything and discovered she was still standing. Her testimony was devastating in its simplicity. She didn't raise her voice, didn't gesture dramatically, didn't try to perform for the cameras. She simply told the truth. "I worked for the city for 8 years, she said, her voice steady. "I loved my job. I believed in serving the community. When I discovered the irregularities in the contracting process, I followed protocol. I reported it to my supervisor, then to his supervisor, then to the ethics board. Each time I was told to let it go, to stop stirring up trouble, to remember who pays my salary." Brandon's cross-examination was brutal, designed to paint her as a disgruntled employee with a history of complaints. He questioned her memory, her motives, and her character, but with each attack, Monique remained calm, answering his questions with the same measured honesty that had gotten her into trouble in the first place. "Ms. Johnson," Brandon said, his voice dripping with skepticism, "you claim you were fired for reporting corruption, but isn't it true that you had multiple performance reviews noting your attitude problems and difficulty working with colleagues?" Monique met his gaze directly. "The attitude problems started appearing in my reviews only after I filed my first complaint. Before that, I had 8 years of excellent evaluations. I can provide documentation if needed." "And these colleagues you had difficulty working with, could it be that your accusations made them uncomfortable? That maybe you were the problem?" Darius Bell rose to object, but Simone was already leaning forward, her voice carrying a warning that made the courtroom go silent. "Mr. Whitaker, the witness has answered your question. Unless you have evidence to support your implications, I suggest you move on to matters of fact rather than speculation." Brandon's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Of course, Your Honor." As the day wore on, a pattern emerged. Witness after witness took the stand, city employees, contractors, and community members who had watched the corruption flourish while essential services deteriorated. Each testified to the same culture of silence, the same pressure to look the other way, the same consequences for those who spoke up. Ted Mason, the payroll clerk who had risked his job to testify, was particularly compelling. A soft-spoken man in his 50s, he had worked for the city for 23 years, raising 4 children on his modest salary. His testimony about the systematic suppression of whistleblowers was delivered with the careful precision of someone who had kept meticulous records, knowing that one day he might need them. "I kept copies of everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every email, every memo, every conversation I overheard. I knew what was happening wasn't right, but I also knew what happened to people who spoke up. I have a family to feed." Brandon's cross-examination of Ted was particularly harsh, an obvious attempt to discredit him as a disloyal employee with questionable motives. But Simone watched the exchange with increasing displeasure, her expression growing colder with each leading question and subtle insult. "Mr. Mason," Brandon pressed, "how long have you worked for the city?" "Long enough to know how these cases usually turn out." Ted looked down, uncomfortable but honest. "Yes, sir. I've seen a lot of good people get hurt for trying to do the right thing." "And how do you know your memory isn't influenced by your friendship with Ms. Johnson? Maybe you misunderstood what you saw." Before Ted could answer, Simone cut in, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Mr. Whitaker, this is not an interrogation. The witness will answer questions relevant to the case, not endure character assassination. If you continue this line of questioning, you will be held in contempt of court." Brandon swallowed hard, his lips pressed into a thin line. The judge's authority was absolute, and he felt it like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. During the afternoon recess, Brandon huddled with his team in the courthouse cafeteria, his usual confidence replaced by barely controlled panic. The case was slipping away from him, and he knew it. Every witness, every document, every piece of evidence seemed to support Monique's version of events. "We need to attack her credibility," he told his junior associates. "Find something, anything that makes her look unreliable. Personal problems, financial issues, anything that suggests she had ulterior motives." Suzanne Beard, a young associate who had always admired Brandon's reputation, looked uncomfortable. "Sir, we've already done extensive background research. Ms. Johnson's record is clean. She's been active in her church, volunteers at her daughter's school, has no criminal history, no financial problems beyond what you'd expect from someone who's been unemployed for 6 months. Brandon's voice rose, drawing stares from nearby tables. "Then dig deeper. There has to be something. People don't just decide to torpedo their careers for no reason." Marcus Rodriguez, another associate, cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Whitaker, what if she's telling the truth? What if the city really did fire her for reporting corruption?" Brandon stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language. "The city is our client, Marcus. Our job is to defend them, not to play judge and jury. But what if defending them means covering up real corruption? What if we're on the wrong side?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Brandon had never considered the possibility that he might be wrong, that his clients might be the villains in this story. His entire career had been built on the assumption that his side was the right side, that winning was its own justification. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown throughout the day. What had started as a handful of supporters had become a full-fledged demonstration. Church groups, community organizations, and civil rights activists had all converged on the courthouse steps. Signs reading, "Justice for Monique," "Truth over power," and "Corruption has no place in our city," filled the air. Pastor Lamar Green of Mount Olive Baptist Church had organized prayer circles on the courthouse lawn. "We're not here to cause trouble," he told reporters. "We're here to witness justice, to make sure that the powerful can't just sweep this under the rug like they always do." Kayla Johnson, Monique's 15-year-old daughter, stood with her grandmother watching the proceedings through the courthouse windows. Her eyes were bright with a mixture of pride and fear. Pride in her mother's courage, fear of what might happen if they lost. "Mama's been fighting this for 2 years, Kayla told a reporter. "She could have just stayed quiet, kept her head down and found another job, but she said somebody had to stand up. She said, 'If we don't fight for what's right, who will?'" Inside the courthouse, Jasmine Williams felt the weight of all those watching eyes. This wasn't just about one case anymore. It was about whether the system could actually work for people like Monique, people like herself, people who had been told for so long that they didn't matter. Late in the afternoon, Darius Bell presented what would become known as the smoking gun evidence. Through a series of public records requests and careful investigation, he had uncovered a pattern of retaliation that went far beyond Monique's case. "Your Honor," Darius said, approaching the bench with a thick folder, "I would like to present Exhibit 47, a compilation of personnel records for city employees who filed complaints with the Ethics Board over the past 5 years. The documents painted a damning picture. Of the 37 employees who had filed ethics complaints, 31 had been subsequently disciplined, demoted, or fired. The pattern was so consistent that it was almost mathematical." Brandon objected furiously. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant to the case at hand. We're here to discuss Ms. Johnson's employment. not to conduct a fishing expedition through city personnel files. Simone reviewed the documents carefully, her expression growing more serious with each page. Mr. Whitaker, establishing a pattern of retaliation is absolutely relevant to this case. The evidence will be admitted. As Darius walked through the evidence pointing out the systematic nature of the retaliation, murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Even some of the reporters looked stunned. This wasn't just about one woman's wrongful termination. It was about a culture of corruption that had been protected by fear and silence. Desperate to salvage his case, Brandon called city manager Robert Hayes to the stand. Hayes was a career bureaucrat, a man who had survived 3 mayors and countless political storms by keeping his head down and his mouth shut. On the witness stand, he looked like a man who would rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Hayes," Brandon began, "in your professional opinion, was Ms. Johnson terminated for legitimate reasons?" Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "She was terminated for violating city policy and insubordination. And these alleged corruption issues she claimed to have discovered, were they investigated?" "We looked into her complaints and found no evidence of wrongdoing." Darius Bell's cross-examination was surgical. "Mr. Hayes, you say you investigated Ms. Johnson's complaints. Can you provide documentation of this investigation?" Hayes fumbled through his papers. We handled it internally." "So there's no written record of this investigation?" Not in the formal sense." "Who conducted the investigation?" "I did." "And what was your methodology?" Hayes was sweating now. "I spoke with the relevant parties." "Which parties?" The people who were accused." "And did you interview any witnesses?" "Review any documents, examine any financial records." I asked around." The courtroom was dead silent. Even Brandon looked mortified at his witness's performance. "Mr. Hayes," Darius continued, "isn't it true that you never conducted any investigation at all? That you simply asked the accused parties if they had done anything wrong, and when they said no, you closed the matter?" Hayes's voice was barely audible. "I did what I thought was appropriate." "And firing Ms. Johnson for reporting corruption, was that also what you thought was appropriate?" "Objection!" Brandon shouted, but the damage was done. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the courthouse windows, both sides prepared for closing arguments. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with people standing in the aisles and spilling out into the hallway. Darius Bell rose first, his voice carrying the weight of decades of fighting these battles. "Your Honor, this case is about more than one woman's career. It's about the soul of our city. It's about whether we live in a place where truth matters more than power, where doing the right thing is rewarded rather than punished." He walked through the evidence methodically, building his case like a master craftsman laying bricks. The pattern of retaliation, the lack of any real investigation, and the systematic suppression of whistleblowers, it all pointed to a culture of corruption that had been allowed to flourish in the shadows. Ms. Johnson didn't ask for this fight, Darius concluded. She just wanted to do her job, to serve her community, to make sure that taxpayer money was spent honestly. For that, she was destroyed. But today we have the chance to say that enough is enough, that truth will not be silenced, that justice will not be denied. Brandon's closing argument was a masterpiece of legal gymnastics, attempting to reframe the entire case as a disgruntled employee's vendetta against her former employer. But his words sounded hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence, and even he seemed to know it. "Your Honor," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence, "employment disputes are unfortunate, but they're not always about discrimination or retaliation. Sometimes employees and employers simply don't see eye to eye. The city had legitimate concerns about Ms. Johnson's performance and conduct. But as he spoke, Brandon could see the faces in the gallery, could see the doubt in their eyes, the way they looked at him not as a champion of justice, but as an obstacle to it. For the first time in his career, he felt like the villain in his own story. The courtroom fell silent as Justice Simone Carter prepared to deliver her ruling. She had spent the recess reviewing her notes, considering the evidence, and wrestling with the weight of the decision. This wasn't just about one case. It was about setting a precedent, about sending a message that would resonate far beyond the walls of this courthouse. "This court," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room, "has heard testimony about a culture of corruption that has been allowed to flourish in the shadows, protected by fear and silence. We have heard about employees who tried to do the right thing and were punished for it. We have heard about a system that values loyalty over integrity, convenience over justice." She paused, letting her words sink in. In the gallery, Monique Johnson sat with her daughter, both of them holding their breath. "The evidence in this case is overwhelming," Justice Carter continued. "Ms. Johnson was not terminated for poor performance or insubordination. She was fired because she had the courage to speak truth to power, because she refused to be complicit in a system that was stealing from the very people it was meant to serve." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Simone raised her hand for silence. "The law is clear on this matter. Employees have the right to report corruption without fear of retaliation. When that right is violated, there must be consequences, not just for the sake of the individual employee, but for the sake of the entire system of government that depends on honest public servants." She looked directly at Brandon, then at the city officials in the gallery. "This court finds that Ms. Johnson was wrongfully terminated in violation of state and federal whistleblower protection laws. The city is ordered to reinstate her with full back pay and benefits, and to pay punitive damages in the amount of $200,000. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Monique Johnson buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by emotion. Her daughter hugged her tightly, both of them crying with relief and joy. As the crowd celebrated outside the courthouse, Justice Carter retreated to her chambers, the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. She had done what she believed was right, but she knew this was just the beginning. The ruling would send shockwaves through the city's power structure, and the pushback would be swift and fierce. Her clerk, Deshaun Miller, entered with a cup of tea and a knowing smile. "The phones are already ringing," he said. "Interview requests, speaking engagements, law schools wanting you to deliver lectures." Simone shook her head. "Later, let's finish today first." She stood at the window, watching the celebration on the courthouse steps. Monique Johnson was surrounded by supporters, her face glowing with vindication. Jasmine Williams and Malik Jones were giving interviews to reporters, their voices strong and clear as they explained what the verdict meant for the community. But it was the sight of young Kayla Johnson that moved her most. The 15-year-old stood tall beside her mother, no longer the frightened child who had watched her family struggle through 2 years of unemployment and uncertainty. She looked like a young woman who had learned that fighting for justice was worth any sacrifice. Across town, Brandon Whitaker sat alone in his office, staring at the city lights outside his window. The defeat stung, but it was more than that. For the first time in his career, he had been forced to confront the possibility that he had been wrong, not just about this case, but about everything he had built his life on. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, some offering condolences, others distancing themselves from the loss. But it was the message from his father that cut deepest. "Son, I saw the news. We need to talk about your future at the firm." Brandon deleted the message without responding. He thought about Justice Carter's calm authority, about the way she had commanded the courtroom without raising her voice or making threats. He thought about Monique Johnson's quiet dignity, about the way she had refused to be broken even when everything was stacked against her. He thought about the choice he had made that morning when he had looked at Simone Carter and seen only what he expected to see, a woman who didn't matter, someone he could dismiss without a second thought. He wondered how many other people he had overlooked, how many other opportunities for justice he had missed because he had been too arrogant to see beyond his own assumptions. The next morning, news of the verdict made headlines across the state. Editorial boards called for investigations into city corruption. Civil rights groups hailed it as a landmark victory. Law schools added it to their curricula as a perfect example of how the system could work when judges had the courage to stand up to power. But for Monique Johnson, the victory was both an ending and a beginning. She had won the right to return to her job, but she also knew that the city had changed. The culture of corruption that had thrived in the shadows was now exposed to the light, and there would be consequences. As she walked up the courthouse steps that morning, surrounded by supporters and reporters, she thought about the 2 years of struggle that had led to this moment. She thought about the nights she had lain awake wondering if she had made the right choice, if the fight was worth the cost. Now she knew. The fight was always worth it. In the weeks that followed, the verdict's impact spread far beyond Jefferson County. Other cities began reviewing their own personnel policies, terrified of facing similar lawsuits. Whistleblower protection laws were strengthened in several states. Law schools held symposiums on the case, examining its implications for civil rights law and government accountability. But perhaps the most important impact was on the young lawyers who had watched the case unfold. Jasmine Williams found herself flooded with requests from law students wanting to work on similar cases. Malik Jones was invited to speak at conferences about the importance of representation in the legal system. They both accepted every invitation, knowing that their story could inspire others to fight for justice. They had learned that the law was only as strong as the people willing to enforce it, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not in boardrooms or country clubs, but in small courtrooms where ordinary people stood up for what was right. Years later, when legal scholars looked back on the case of Taylor versus City of Jefferson, they would recognize it as a turning point, not just in civil rights law, but in the broader struggle for justice in America. They would note how one woman's courage had inspired a generation of lawyers to fight for the powerless, how one judge's integrity had reminded the legal system of its highest calling. But Justice Simone Carter never saw it that way. To her, it was simply another day at the office, another chance to ensure that the law served everyone equally. She continued to preside over cases with the same quiet authority, the same unwavering commitment to justice that had made her a legend. And in her private moments, when she was alone in her chambers with her thoughts and her conscience, she would sometimes think about that morning in the courthouse hallway when an arrogant lawyer had looked at her and seen nothing worth his notice. She would think about all the time she had been underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed, and she would smile, knowing that sometimes the most powerful people in the room were the ones nobody saw coming. The fight for justice never ends. Even after the verdict, even after the celebrations and the headlines, the work continues. Corruption still exists in the shadows, and there are still people who need someone to stand up for them. There are still lawyers who think they can get away with anything, and judges who forget that their power comes with responsibility. But there are also people like Monique Johnson who refuse to be silenced. There are lawyers like Jasmine Williams and Malik Jones who choose to fight for the powerless rather than the powerful. And there are judges like Simone Carter who remember that justice isn't just about following the law, it's about making sure the law serves everyone equally. The story of Taylor v. City of Jefferson is really the story of America itself. the ongoing struggle between power and justice, between the way things are and the way they should be. It's the story of ordinary people who find extraordinary courage when they're faced with a choice between doing what's easy and doing what's right. And it's the story of a legal system that, despite all its flaws, still has the power to change lives and transform communities when it's guided by people who believe in justice for all. The gavel falls, but the fight continues.